And I'd like to thank Judy for setting this up, and I think we've all benefited from it. I would imagine that all of us have guided in synagogues in Eretz Yisrael. It's a part of our identity. It's part of who we are. It's a part of our past that we want to show people. I want to talk about what was going on in the synagogue as far as the...
Judy, mute everyone. Sorry.
Mute everyone, or
I'll do it right now. Sorry.
Okay, thank you.
Good.
Anyway, I'm not going to talk about what the liturgy in its entirety in the synagogue, but I thought I could talk about a couple of points which I think is more relevant for our guiding, because obviously the main question that we get as guides is, what's that? And therefore I'm going to try to tie in a few points regarding the liturgy of the land of Israel during the Byzantine and early Arab, and more during the Arab periods, in light of what we're actually looking at. So Yosef Yalom gave us a quote, which is a real gold mine, I think, which I put on the screen. The Kaliri, we'll talk about him later on, Elazar HaKalir, really the Paitan par excellence of the land of Israel, tends to use the name of the constellation in a picturesque way, as if the image of the constellation is sitting in front of him in the mosaic on the floor of the synagogue where he is serving as cantor. So Yalom is saying that we're all familiar with Chamat Tveria as well as Beit Alpha. We'll go back and forth between these two, and the famous pictures of the constellations that we see on the floor with Helios, etc., etc. And it wasn't just artwork that was going on in the synagogue during this period, in the Byzantine period and the Arab period. Let's talk first mainly about the Byzantine period, but especially in communities where many of the tefillah was by heart, or in turn, only the cantor would be holding a machzor of some sort with the actual liturgy. Number two, the liturgy itself was in the process of being made. It was not a set thing like we have in our synagogues today, but because many piyutim were a major focus, liturgical poetry was a major focus of the service in Eretz Yisrael in particular. So when you went to synagogue that day, you didn't necessarily know what you were hearing. So to enable you to follow along with what the cantor was saying, being that you didn't have any type of prayer book, any type of machzor in your hand, you would look at the floor, at the decorations that we're looking at today, and you'd be looking at what you see over there, and that would enable you to follow the service much better. The piyut that we're looking at right now is a kina for Tisha B'Av, one of the dirges which was recited on Tisha B'Av night. It is recited according to the vast majority of practices nowadays, and it's recited on Tisha B'Av night not just amongst Ashkenazim that had much more of a tendency to preserve liturgical poetry from the land of Israel, but this one is very popular and is said in most non-Ashkenazi community as well. Ad Ana, and this is a very early kina from what's called the pre-classical period of piyutim. That generally speaking, the two main eras of piyutim are divided up into pre-classical and classical piyutim in the land of Israel, with the classical era being divided up into two, early classical and then I think it's called general classical. The early classical period, we're talking about very early, I would say before the year 550. We're talking about for a good bulk of the Byzantine period. Early classical is poetry that was piyutim that do not rhyme. If it doesn't rhyme, then generally speaking, that means it's from a very early period of piyutim. And right over here, we have a kina for Tisha B'Av. And it says, if you look on the second line, it talks about how the constellations themselves wept over the destruction of the temple. V'af mazalot yizlu dim'ah. And indeed, the entire kina over here goes through how each one of the constellations, and using various plays on words and the like, it explains how each one of the constellations itself is weeping for the churban, or something connected to the word that is used to describe one of the constellations connected to something that happened in the during the destruction of the temple. In line 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, Nergu vitulot v'gam b'churim ki alken bitula kadra pana. It talks about bitula that this constellation it is sad because bitulot, because virgins were killed during the destruction of the temple, and so on and so forth. So very early on, keeping in mind if we go and we talk about the synagogue in Beit Alpha, I believe working with the assumption that it's 6th century-ish. So it could very well be that either this kina might have been around, and therefore the cantor would have used the constellations in order to enable himself to remember the words. If he didn't have it and had to remember it by heart in order to get the order, or at least the people in the congregation would need to do so. In turn, it could be the other way around, that it could be that this kina was after Beit Alpha and other similar synagogues were built, with the constellation mosaics on the floor, and therefore the Paitan himself, we do not know who it was inspired to therefore use this motif of this motif of the constellations in describing how the universe, so to speak, weeps for the destruction of the temple. Later on, when we go to the next period of piyutim, of liturgical poetry, is the period of the classical period. The main difference between pre-classical and classical is it rhymes. But even in classical, you could divide it up into 2 different groups. One is the mid-6th century, and the paitan par excellence of that period was Yanai, according to the standard Haggadah. For example, we recited one of his piyutim at the very end of the Seder, Vahi b'chatzi halayla, which is part of the piyut that he wrote to be recited not during the Seder, but during the but as part of liturgy for Parshat Bo, or not the Parshat Bo because of the Triennial Cycle, but the Parsha that starts with the words Vahi b'chatzi halayla, which was one of the Parshiot from the book of Exodus, which was written in the Triennial Cycle in the land of Israel. On that Shabbat, the liturgical poetry that Yanai composed for it started with Vahi b'chatzi halayla and goes through all of the various midrashim about various events that happened throughout the Tanakh that happened that had or will happen on that very special Leil Shimurim, the night of the Pesach. Later on, we have a big jump, and in the following century, in the 7th century, we have Rabbi Elazar HaKalir, who not only used rhyming, but developed an entirely new style of liturgical poetry, which was much, much more complex, often even had to coin his own words, and in order to make other words rhymed. And he really, really was a paitan par excellence. And until today, much of what he composed is part of the Ashkenazi liturgy and is the much more difficult thing. And therefore, that's the things which in the modern era was much more likely to be dropped, as opposed to certain piyutim of Yanai. Which is a very popular still in the Ashkenazi Machzor, or Lakel Orech Din, which is also from Yanai, and those are, even today we see that difference, that the early classical piyutim are still more popular than the ones from Elazar HaKalir. Elazar HaKalir lived in the 7th century. It's generally accepted that he lived during the Byzantine period, lived through the Persian conquest of the land of Israel, and then is believed to have died at some point after the Byzantines reconquered the land of Israel before the Arab conquest, because he makes no mention of the Arabs in the land. And this is the synagogue in Chamat Tveria. It's generally accepted that Rabbi Elazar HaKalir lived in Tveria. And as a result, when he composed his piyutim, he may have very well thinking of this particular mosaic over here. The piyutim for that Rabbi Elazar HaKalir, he wrote many piyutim throughout the entire year. Shulamit Alitzur has dealt with a lot of them, but really, there's endless amounts that could be talked about the piyutim of the Kalir. Out of the piyutim of the Kalir that survived and are still recited to a certain extent in Ashkenaz, two of the most popular are the piyutim of the piyut that's recited on Shmini Atzeret for Geshem, Tfilat Geshem, and Tfilat Tal that was recited maybe by ourselves for those of us who had patience or generally in synagogues on the first day of Pesach. In the land of Israel in general, Tal and Geshem were split. It was considered to be that things were split into two. Half the year, the focus of the prayers were on Geshem from Shmini Atzeret until the first day of Pesach. From Pesach until Shmini Atzeret, the focus on the of the liturgy was very much Tal. All fragments that we have from the Cairo Geniza have people pray, have both the mention in the second bracha of Shemona Esrei, as well as a request for doing the ninth bracha of Shemona Esrei in all of the things that came out of liturgy in Eretz Yisrael. And as opposed to in Bavel, where most people, while everybody mentioned rain in the second blessing, but most, according to most fragments, the Cairo Geniza, there is no mention of dew. Obviously, dew is what enables our country to be, instead of being a desert country, because we don't have rain for half the year. Without dew, then the country would be considerably more arid. It would be impossible to grow almost anything without the dew in the mountainous areas and the like, as we all know. The piyut from Tal that is said nowadays in most synagogue is considerably shorter, and only a very small part was said. The piyut that Rabbi Elazar HaKalir composed is actually, there are 7 blessings in the Musaf that we say on the Chag, and there were the main focus of the, as Morid Atal was recited in the second blessing, so the main focus of the piyut was in the second blessing, but there were shorter parts which were recited on the 5 blessings afterwards. Those were lost though, and did not make its way to Europe, and therefore did not seem like it was recited in any period after the Crusades in the land of Israel. However, the bulk of the piyut survived and made its way to Europe, and we see over here Elim biyom mechusan, that one part of this very long piyut, which was which in Ashkenaz at least was the focal point of the liturgical poetry that's recited on the first day of Pesach, Tfilat Tal, that is. We see over here that he, similar to what we saw in the piyut of An Anna, that he asks for dew, and each time makes a reference to the months of the year, along with the constellations, and which is a similar thing, which really goes back to this point which we saw from Yosef Yalon about what the Kaliri would do, that this was his synagogue, possibly. This is what he was looking at. And they composed a piyut based on that and went through the entire year, not just in the perspective of the what we nowadays call, or by then were called, the Jewish months. Obviously, in antiquity, these months were used by many others. But the idea that the constellations, so to speak, are connected to it, and using the constellations as a way of guiding us through the year, is a way of asking for dew. And in the parallel piyut that we have for Tfilat Geshem, we have the same thing for rain. And this is what he was looking at, which may have been what inspired him, or possibly some sort of other synagogue in Chamatveria with a similar constellation. The mosaic actually became part of liturgy, so to speak, and made it from the floor into the machzor. Fascinatingly enough, the piyutim from the land of Israel often made their way into the Ashkenazi machzor. It goes so far as to say that variations of the tefillot themselves, often in the classic Ashkenazi machzor, for example, instead of in the fifth bracha of Musaf on Chagim, when the Chazan would, on days that the practice in Ashkenaz was, instead of saying Machazir Shchinato L'Tzion, which is the standard liturgy throughout the year, the Nusach is changed to Otcha Levadcha B'Yira Na'avod, which seems to have been taken from the Nusach of the temple itself. That was one of the brachot that was said in the temple itself, according to Rashi, and that seems to be the case from various things in the Cairo Geniza regarding that Nusach was maintained in the land of Israel, while in Bavel they said it much more in, let's say, real time, and instead of saying the Nusach from the temple, they made it more about the restoration of the temple. Interestingly enough, in the Reform movement, when they rejected the idea of return to Zion, so they actually switched it for the entire year. They took this Ashkenazi Nusach from the temple of She'otcha Levadcha B'Yira Na'avod, and because that Nusach does not mention the temple, because they did not, at that point, the Reform movement rejected the idea of return to the land of Israel, so they actually took that liturgy from the temple and used it to replace the standard liturgy of Machazir Shchinato Tzion, because they did not want to mention Tzion. Lately, that has changed, and the Reform movement that has adopted Zionism actually reverted back to the standard nusach, which is used by most communities, which is used throughout the year in all communities, of saying Hamachzir Shchinato L'Tzion. Some even threw in the word Hamachzir Shchinato Ve'amo L'Tzion. But anyway, in Ashkenaz, the piyutim from the land of Israel made its way to Ashkenaz, which is an interesting discussion about where Ashkenazim come from, what relationship they have with the land of Israel versus what relation did they have with obviously the other major Jewish center of Bavel, which is a major hotspot right now amongst the various scholars. What extent the tradition of learning is more connected? At what point was the Talmud Yerushalmi the focus of learning the land in Ashkenaz? And only later did the Bavli replace it, or did the Bavli always rule? Is a big argument right now. If anybody wants to read anything more about that, one can read Dr. approach. But regarding liturgy, there's no question that there was, not regarding the obligatory liturgy, the Nusach HaKeva, in which the Talmud Bavli definitely won out at the very least in the long term, and therefore we recite the liturgy based on what the Talmud Bavli requires. But regarding the additional parts of liturgy, which are not obligatory per se, the piyutim, those, the Eretz Yisrael, either the piyutim that were composed in Eretz Yisrael, or later piyutim in Ashkenaz written according to the styles used in Eretz Yisrael, were used. And therefore, the piyut of the Kalir made its way to the land to Ashkenaz from the land of Israel and other places in Europe early on as well. And as we know, although I'm only licensed to guide in Israel, I haven't guided in Europe, and I've never visited any medieval synagogues in Europe, and unfortunately there aren't so many to see anyway. But I don't believe that we know about, anybody can correct me afterwards, I'm unaware of synagogues that have like sorts of mosaics of the constellations anywhere in Europe. So they're having those constellations in order to accompany the Chazan in the synagogue. So the piyutim, so to speak,
Eli,
took the pictures which appeared in. Yeah.
hi, excuse me. I'm sorry to interrupt. Is it possible?
Hello.
Hi, can you hear me?
Yes, I can. I'm sorry.
Okay.
Yes.
All right. I'm not sure, but your internet is not in its strongest location. Is it at all possible you can move a little to
I'm
get?
at a desktop.
I'm sorry, what?
I'm at a desktop. I'm sorry. Do you hear me at all?
We hear you. Every so often you fade out. So
Okay, fine.
I will.
If you could type something. Okay. I'll try to speak slower and hope it goes through.
Okay, great. Thank you.
Okay. That over here, this is Masor Miza. And we see over here about how the idea, at least, of illustration went from the mosaics of the land of Israel that we see in Tzipori, Beit Alpha, Hamat, Tveria, to the pages over here. And generally speaking, machzorim do not have, in the early period you see some, but there isn't that much in the way of artwork in machzorim. But over here you see very early on, although even you see sometimes the faces of animals on people because of the prohibition of painting it was understood to be that one was not allowed to paint human pictures. But we see the idea of the constellations being connected to the liturgy over here in this machzor and many of the other machzorim that we have in the in Ashkenaz at the time. Interestingly enough, even though printed machzorim didn't really have illustrations at all, but the practice of using the constellations for this point in the piyut made its way even into the printed machzor. Not all the machzorim have it, but if one looks even at the art, you can't get obviously more concerned with the small c than art scroll. This part of the piyut, which is not translated because it's put in the back of the machzor because most congregations no longer recite it. But we see over here though that it's almost, that's the way you make a machzor. That when you make a machzor, you put in this piyut elim b'yom mechusan, and you can't have this piyut without the accompanying pictures of the constellations. So I don't know where Art Scroll got these drawings from. I don't believe they do it themselves. They probably took it from an earlier machzor. But all of the early printed machzorim, and I believe all the machzorim that were printed in Europe before the Holocaust, had these pictures. Some of the ones in Israel today, Koren and Rinat Israel do not have these pictures. But we see, though, that tradition is a tradition, and that this piyut has to be together with the pictures of the constellations. So I believe that we have a journey which starts in Beit Alpha and makes its way from the floor of the synagogues in the land of Israel to the illustrated handwritten machzorim that we had in Europe, which are real works of art. And even on the even the printed machzorim, which were not really meant to be a work of art, but were mass produced, and therefore were not meant to be anything more of something to enable people to use during in the synagogue when they prayed. That tradition was carried on to the year 2012 with Art Scroll, and that these are the only pictures that I believe any prayer book, any Art Scroll prayer book, Siddur or Machzor has, is only for the piyutim of Tal and Geshem. To go on to another topic, this is the synagogue in Scioscia, which we've all been at. And interestingly enough, on the right side, we have, next to the right menorah, we have a lulav on one side, the machta, the shovel that was used for the that was used for the Torah, on to the right of the right menorah, and beneath that you have a shofar. What's the shofar doing there in particular? It seems out of place. The shofar is blown on Rosh Hashanah, although the shofar was used in the temple. But the main thing which the shofar is associated with is Rosh Hashanah, where it was blown everywhere. So why is it connected to the temple per se? The lulav, there's a mitzvah in the Torah, the lulav in the etrog that we see to the right of the lulav. The Torah commands us to use it in the temple. It is used every day in the mikdash, according to the Mishnah and according to Rashi's understanding, it's talking about the temple itself. And as opposed to outside of the mikdash, one is only obligated to take the 4 species on the first day of the Chag, but in the temple itself, one is obligated throughout the entire 7 days of Sukkot. So therefore, we understand what that's doing there. Why is the shofar there? So we know, and this year Rosh Hashanah comes out on Shabbat, that the shofar is not blown outside of the mikdash on Shabbat. The question is why? So the Bavli entertains what we're going to see later on in the Yerushalmi, but rejects that idea. And Rabbah famously said that really we should be blowing shofar on Rosh Hashanah even if it falls out on Shabbat. But because one is not permitted to carry in a public domain on Shabbat, we're afraid that somebody is going to carry the shofar in order to learn how to use it. Therefore, the rabbis went and made a rule that the shofar should not be blown outside of the temple on Shabbat anywhere, in order that nobody should end up violating Shabbat in order to perform the mitzvah. The Yerushalmi and the Bavli entertain this idea but rejects it. I don't want to go through the entire thing, but it says that we have two verses in the Torah. Katuv echad omer tshuva, v'katuv echad omer zichron tshuva. I'm reading from the fourth line of the paragraph here. Chal b'Shabbat zichron tshuva, b'sha'ah shu chal b'chol tshuva, b'sha'ah chal b'Shabbat zichron tshuva, mazkirim avalo toki. That on Shabbat we do not blow the shofar, but instead we just mention the shofar, and that's the mitzvah. And then the Gemara asks, you might think that in the temple one does not blow shofar if Rosh Hashanah falls out on Shabbat. Tana be'echad lachodesh, me'ata, it says on the first day, me'ata afilu b'makom she'em yodim shu be'echad lachodesh yidacha. You might think that even in a place where you know that it's Rosh Hashanah, keeping in mind that that's the place where Rosh Hashanah was announced, when Rosh Chodesh would be announced, and where the witnesses would come to announce that this day was Rosh Hashanah, you might think you don't blow the shofar there either. Tani Rabbi Shimon bar Yochai v'kravtem. The next pasuk says, and then it talks about you bring the karban, you bring the sacrifice. B'makom she'akarbanot krevin. So in a place where karbanot are brought, there you blow shofar even on Shabbat. This is what the Yerushalmi holds. Therefore, the mitzvah of Tkiyat Shofar, according to the Torah, based on the Yerushalmi, which presumably the Talmud that was studied in Scioscia, understood that they're fundamentally speaking, there's a special mitzvah to blow the shofar on Shabbat and Rosh Hashanah in the Beit HaMikdash, and only in the Beit HaMikdash. And therefore, the shofar is something which I believe is appropriate to be put together with the Lulav and the Machta and the Menorah, which are obviously temple connected. I wanted to finish off with one other point about the liturgical poetry of the land of Israel, which isn't anything which I found in the any mosaics in the synagogues over here, but that is that we know that in the land of Israel there was a triennial cycle, and that the Torah took 3 years to complete, as opposed to the Babylonian practice, the Torah is finished annually. If you thought, therefore, that people would get out of shul earlier, you're wrong. The reason why they divided the Torah in such a strange way in a triennial cycle, which the annual cycle I would think makes a lot more sense, is because the service was so long over there, because they would expound on the reading of the Torah considerably. In those days, both in the Byzantine period and in the Arab period, it was self-understood that the Torah was translated into Aramaic, and the Targum was used to translate the Torah, even in the time period after Arabic became the dominant language of the Jews in the land of Israel. The Torah was still translated to Aramaic, but that wasn't all. The translator wouldn't just translate, he would expound. And therefore, there's a whole other genre of liturgy, of poetry that went with the translation of the Torah. Some of it's found in the Cairo Geniza. In Ashkenaz, the practice was not to translate the Torah in general. On the summer holidays of Pesach and Shavuot, in some communities, the Haftarot were translated. And the other practice of medieval in Ashkenaz, on the 7th day of Pesach, as well as on the first day of Shavuot, what we call Shavuot, the Torah would be translated into Aramaic. They retained the tradition from the land of Israel on those days in particular. And along with those translations, what are called Piyutei Targum would be recited. And that instead of just translating the words, there was much liturgical poetry that was written in Aramaic, the language of the translation, to go along with the translation. So on Shavuot, and I have to thank two people that enabled me to give this presentation. I'm a little bit annoyed at my internet provider because it's always been so lousy. I apologize for that. But I'd like to thank Dr. Wasserman, who wrote an unpublished article about the pictures of in medieval machzorim, as well as somebody who I don't know from Adam, Laura, Dr. Laura Suzanne Lieber, who wrote a book on Aramaic translation piyutim, Jewish Aramaic poetry from late antiquity. I do not know her at all, but she found a student presentation in her book, which I'm very thankful for. So before, on the Shavuot, we read the Aseret HaDibrot. So the before the sixth commandment, Lo Tirtzach, so the following piyut was recited, Itkabar b'chelei Adoniah bar Chagit, which is fascinating to me because it's a ballad, and it goes through the story of the poem is not about Adoniah per se, but it's mostly about, and you could read it and you could take a look at it. It goes through we know that David commanded Shlomo to kill Yoav ben Tzruya, who is the head of his own army, and it goes through, and I don't know what the source for the piyut is, but it goes through Shlomo going through the act of executing Yoav because of because he had murdered Amasa ben Yeter and Avner ben Ner. And here we have a whole back and forth, just to go through the English, about, we see from Othalid, for Solomon the king, do not hearken to me, condemn me to death. Do you not remember me, O King Solomon? He begs for his life. And the piyut goes on, and it even has this moment of Yoav commanding his son Yoel, who we don't know of outside of this piyut, to weep for your father, and how he begged Benaiah ben Yoyada to save his life, and the piyut goes on and on and on. In the land of Israel, the piyut actually ended with Rechavam being afraid to kill the one who killed his own brother Avshalom. And the piyut over here, Otaf on the English, Solomon the king was also said, whoa, what shall I do with my father's oath? And that's where the piyut end. Later editions of the piyut, actually, probably written in Ashkenaz later on, actually went ahead and finished the story with Benaiah ben Yehoiada and decapitating Yoav, and finishes. This part is not in the translation. Tohu Bachi, in the last line, Yisrael Bachi Rabba Mitkata Yoav bar Tzruya, about how the entire all of Israel cried and wept on the death of Yoav ben Tzruya. So over here we have an example of medieval ballad, like you have them in English and Scandinavian languages, or you have many that made its way to English from Scandinavian languages. That's the few that I've read for those who are familiar with medieval poetry, and you had many of these ideas of either midrashim or even other stories that we don't know what their sources are, make it into these ballads. So when it was talking about Lo Tirtzach, it wasn't talking about, well, you shouldn't be walking around the street, and if you see somebody you don't like, you shouldn't murder him. It was trying to say, no, Lo Tirtzach means even somebody like Yoav ben Tzruya that had all the reasons in the world possibly to kill Amasa ben Yeter or Avner ben Ner, and thought he had a million excuses why there was appropriate behavior. Lo Tirtzach was talking to him. And this is what happens to murderers, even murderers that their road to hell was full of good intentions, like Yoav ben Tzruya, who ended up getting executed, and definitely murder is murder is murder is murder. And that's the idea of this particular ballad, which was recited both in the land of Israel and in early Ashkenaz, never made its way to printing, as part of the elaborate translation which took place of the Ten Commandments. I apologize that the internet connection was not as good as it was. I hope feel free to share this, and I would be happy to answer any questions.
Eli, this was fabulous. It's really wonderful. I learned so much, and I have such a different appreciation for the mosaic floors now. I really appreciate everything you shared.
Thank you.
I didn't catch the beginning, Eli. Did you discuss the problematics of the second commandment
No, I meant to, and then I figured maybe somebody, and then I moved on, and I hope somebody asks that. No, and I'm not. I honestly, I don't have any answers. I don't know, and I'm gonna leave that.
There's a book that was put out by Stephen Fine from Yeshiva University.
Oh, all right.
I saw it in the Yad Ben Tzvi library. I don't have it.
Okay,
But
no,
I
I
think
was.
it's worthwhile reading.
Okay,
Lot
thank
of-
you. Thank you. I was going to say that's obviously an issue, and I don't feel like I know enough to discuss it. Thank you.
Eli,
Ellie,
two
I'm
questions.
looking for the keynote that
Sure.
you referred to. I can't find it. Where is it exactly?
What?
The keynote that you referred to with the reference to the Mazalot and then the specific names of each of them.
It is.
I Googled it. You could find it, right? Ad Ana Bochiat B'Tzion. It comes in Hebrew and not in English.
Adana Bechia B'Tzion. It's said on
Yeah.
the night
Yeah,
of Tisha
yeah, yeah.
B'Av.
It pops up pretty easily.
Eli,
Yes.
two questions. First of all, you faded out exactly as you were giving a reference to someone who wrote about the possibility that the Talmud Yerushalmi was dominant in Ashkenaz at the beginning. Who was that you suggested reading?
Well, that was, I would say, that was definitely, I would say, standard approach in scholarship. It was last mentioned, I would say, by Professor Tushma. The main person who came up with the idea was Ben Zion Dinur, who really believed that Ashkenaz was really an extension of the land of Israel. Shockingly enough, he was the first minister of education in the state of Israel. So that was his approach. And that was, I would say, Tushma discussed it. He played it down a little bit, but he went along that line. Recently, Professor Soloveitchik has gone an all-out attack on that approach. And in his collected writings, in the second volume, he comes up with a very interesting alternative approach to the tradition of learning in Ashkenaz.
Okay, great. And also, the thing you mentioned at the end with that poem about Yoav ben Surya, did you connect that at all to a synagogue architecture or artwork? Or that
No,
was just...
not at all. No, just about the liturgy in the land of Israel in general.
Great, thanks.
Can I make one comment, Ellie?
Sure.
I think I understood your talk, but it occurs to me that if I was a poet today, wanting to write liturgy of this type, I could go, for example, to Hadassah Hospital when we can go to the Chagall windows, look at all the pictures that Chagall has put there of the depictions of the Shvatim, and then I can make liturgy poetry based on, the words of the pictures of the Shvatim, and I would be in line with what you explained to us now.
Absolutely.
Absolutely. Okay. I'll do that when this is done. I'll make it.
Okay.
Thank you.
I actually was thinking the opposite. Why, and maybe I missed it, why did you think that they wrote liturgy from the art and not that there was out there some sort of exegesis or understanding or something that expressed itself both in the floors and the liturgy?
Because it doesn't have to be either or, but the synagogue in Hamat Tveria is older than the Kalir. So I believe the Kalir would have seen that synagogue growing up. And that was what he was looking at when he went to Shul.
But somebody had that first interpretation to put it on the floor. What I'm saying is that
We don't.
the Torah Shabbat Peh is much deeper than when it says on Google that Brishi Rabbah was written, or than when anything. There's I assume.
The initial tradition, like the Piyut Ovir Ana B'chiat B'Tzion, may have been along the lines that you're talking about, and that it might have been. This was written in the time of Chazal, and that it wasn't, and that things were put on the floor because this was recited. I just think I was saying that it wasn't, but not necessarily that the Kalir said, "Oh, this idea is on the floor. Let me write about it." But the fact that people were literally looking at it, and people in the shul had no machzor of their own, it enabled them to follow things a lot more instead of just being somebody reciting some poem they never heard before. If it was something that they could actually look at,
Like we do today.
Thank you. It's great.
Okay.
Okay. Thank you.
Thank you, Ellie.
Okay. Thank you, everybody.
Okay, thank you guys. Tomorrow we'll see you. We have Eliyahu McClan, who is going to talk about the Israel-Gaza border situation. Okay, see you tomorrow, 11:30.
11:30?
Okay, bye-bye.
Thank you, Judy.
Ellie, thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye.